Hi, I am Cecilia Erba from the Italian association A Sud. My work is to educate and raise awareness on the topics of the climate crisis and climate justice. But what do we mean with climate justice? Climate on our planet has always changed, but since the Industrial Revolution, the ever-expanding use of fossil fuels, coupled with the effects of deforestation and land use change, has caused more and more greenhouse gases to be released in the atmosphere. The consequence is that average temperatures on Earth are getting hotter and hotter. Today, they are more than 1 degree hotter compared to pre-industrial levels. The release of greenhouse gases and warming temperatures have led to the effects that we already see today: heat waves and floods, tornadoes, droughts, sea level rise, biodiversity loss, with harsh consequences on human communities and societies throughout the world, but especially on the poorest and most vulnerable part of the population. Last year, Cyclone Idai hit hard Southwest Africa, causing more than 1,300 deaths and thousands displaced in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi, and triggering a humanitarian crisis. At the same time, prolonged drought in the Horn of Africa, coupled with devastating floods and most recently locust invasion, are continuously threatening food security and forcing thousands to flee. In the future, such impacts will only worsen if we don't stop anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases immediately and change the way we live. Global sea levels could rise by more than 1 meter in 2100, putting at risk communities living on islands and near to the coasts. Entire ecosystems could collapse, depriving human societies of their basic means of subsistence. According to the United Nations International Organization for Migrations, there could be up to 1 billion environmental migrants by 2050 in the worst scenarios. It's huge. The scientific community has been warning us for 50 years now. We are on the verge of a climate catastrophe, and it's without doubt caused by human activities. However, up to now, the global policy response to such a crisis has been poor. Governments have lost time, avoiding decisions perceived as unpopular and against the economic interests of big oil. Fossil fuel frontiers have been expanding more and more, reaching even the Arctic. Companies have continued to pollute the environment and the air. The science is clear. In order to avoid catastrophic climate change, global warming must be kept under 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. And even so, societies will need to adapt and to improve their resilience to climate change impacts that cannot be avoided. In 2018, the IPCC, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which gathers climate scientists from all over the world, has published its special report on a global warming of 1.5 degrees. It warned that by 2030, global emissions need to be reduced by about a half compared to 2010 levels, and we need to reach emissions neutrality by 2050. Instead, since 1990, global emissions have continued to rise unhampered, except for the global financial crisis of 2007. Today we have the knowledge and capacities to start a global transition, which can lead us to a zero-carbon society, but we lack political will and drive. This is why people from all over the world have started mobilizing to ask governments and companies to abide to what the science says. The international movement for climate justice was born already in the early 2000s from the environmental justice movement and grew exponentially in the last years with the rising awareness also among youth on the climate crisis and the birth of Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion. They demand that the transition is started immediately, and also they want it to be based on human rights, equity, and justice principles. The impacts of climate change indeed put at risk the protection of the most fundamental human rights, beginning with the right to life and the right to health. In addition, anthropogenic climate change has historically been caused by greenhouse gases emitted by Western countries for their own economic development, and Western countries still have among the highest per capita emission rates at global level. But it will be the peoples in the global south to suffer the most from the impacts of climate change, both because they live in regions and areas which already are more impacted, and because they lack economic and technological resources to face it. Climate change impacts are deeply unjust at the root, and it is foreseen that they will only worsen global inequalities, hampering all progress towards sustainable development goals such as zero poverty and hunger. In the global response to climate change, the different responsibilities must be taken into account, and the most vulnerable countries and communities must be supported by richer countries that have towards them a so-called climate debt. Finally, another fundamental principle is intergenerational justice, linked to the duties and responsibilities of past and current generations towards future generations. Today's young and future generations will indeed already disproportionately experience the negative consequences of climate change and bear the burden of the environmental damage done by past generations. It is therefore crucial that the transition to a more just and equal societies which does not pose a threat to environment and human systems is started immediately. The COVID-19 pandemic has reminded all of us of how vulnerable we are. But as the world recovers, we have a unique opportunity to influence and change the choices made for our future, and to build back a more sustainable and just world. We don't have much time left. Let's change the system, not the climate.